Hi, my name is Nelson Abreu, and I'm an instructor at International Academy of Consciousness, and I'm based in Los Angeles. Today, I want to talk to you about evidence about the afterlife. So, this is always a big question that students of the IEC have, which is do we survive physical death? And if so, how can we know? What kind of evidence could there be? Many times, these are people who have experienced loss in their life, and they would like to have reassurance that their loved ones are okay. But other times, it's just a normal human question that has existed probably as long as humans have been around, which is we are confronted with this idea of death, and we really want to know, is that it, or could there be more? It's natural that we would want to believe there is more because that will help us confront the fear of death, and it might help us to be able to live with less fear. However, um, we see the fact is that while most people profess a belief in the afterlife, in the U.S. at least, it's around 70-75%. Uh, when people are confronted with a life or death situation, we can see that there's a difference between having a belief, a hope, and actually feeling like they know. But again, how can you know about the afterlife if you're still here, right? So these are interesting questions we like to explore, and definitely, if you have any questions, I'm happy to address them. Let's start with the kind of evidence that you can get personally. What I mean is this: there isn't evidence that has satisfied the world at large. In other words, if most people around the world, including scientists, felt like there is satisfactory evidence that there is enough proof, then we wouldn't be having this discussion, right? So clearly, we don't have the kind of evidence that will satisfy almost everyone. In fact, if you go to any scientific circle, then you will find people who believe it as a matter of personal faith. But scientifically speaking, they'll find it very difficult to say that consciousness survives death, that our being can survive death, because there isn't widespread, widely accepted evidence of the survival of death. But that's not to say that there isn't any evidence. We're just saying that most scientists, when looking at the evidence, are not going to say, oh, yeah, that's a slam dunk. It's obvious. It's not like that, right? So, how can we look at the evidence in a reasonable way and reach any sort of conclusion? Well, there is a kind of evidence that is not admissible in uh, in science, in the sense that um, it's not going to satisfy other people. However, you can use the scientific spirit to address a question and collect evidence that might be reasonable enough for an individual to make a decision, right? So this sort of personal evidence. So it's still using scientific inquiry, is you're still being skeptical enough, you're asking the right questions, you want some sort of evidence, but this evidence might only satisfy you as a person because it relies on personal observation, personal experience. So, what kind of evidence could you as an individual collect that could give you pretty strong evidence that consciousness might actually survive death? Well, there's a few. One that we study a lot at IAC, the International Academy of Consciousness, is the idea that if you have an out of body experience, a projection of the consciousness, whereby you go to sleep or your body goes to sleep, and then you find yourself awake and conscious, outside of the body, beyond the body. So body's asleep, and you move away from the body in this quote unquote spiritual form. And what if you could then meet someone that has passed away and collect information from them that no one else could know about? There have been cases throughout history. I've met some people who have done that, some of my students over time. But one case that's pretty famous is um, the Queen of Sweden. This is in the 1700s. She calls for a man, a scientist named Emanuel Swedenborg. He was a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences, very well respected scientist, who at some point started having a lot of out of body experiences and other phenomena. And he wrote about it extensively. He became very well known throughout Europe, and he had some pretty amazing out of body experiences where he was able to verify things that were happening at a distance, and people got to know about it. So the Queen asked Swedenborg to tell her how was her brother. Now, her brother had passed away, so she was really asking, is he still around, and how is he doing? So Swedenborg says something along the lines of, "I'll try my best. I'm sure." Um, Probably was careful not to make any promises he wasn't sure he could keep. This is the Queen of Sweden, after all. But the story goes that he did actually come back with some news. Now, he could have said whatever he wanted to, just to reassure the Queen, right? But he came with some evidence. He had information that only the Queen and her brother knew about, and it was strong enough evidence that the Queen totally believed what Swedenborg said, and as a head of state of a country, she did come out and give credit to Swedenborg and said that there's no way he could have known the information that he passed to the Queen without having actually communicated with her brother, right? Now, you can make an argument this is hardly scientific evidence. It's not a controlled experiment. It's not probably not replicable. That this could happen, that could happen, but at a personal level, right? For Swedenborg, for the Queen of Sweden, this was pretty strong evidence. So, and if you can do something like this, and if you can do it once, twice, three times, I mean, how many times before you're satisfied, as that a reasonable person would be satisfied that this makes sense, that consciousness survives death, and that's what I'm submitting to you. That there is very interesting scientific evidence, and we'll talk about it a little bit. But you as a being, you as a consciousness, you can collect information on your own about this. So I participated in an experiment by IAC back in it was 2004. We were in Pennsylvania near New York in this lovely forest and in a cabin, and they rented like a hotel space, and we all were in a ballroom sort of place, lying down, applying OBE, out of body experience techniques, for 3 days. I think we tried maybe 8 times in the course of those 8 days. But that's all we were thinking about, talking about, eating, sleeping, OBE. So we got a really intense immersion. And in that space of time, I and others were able to have multiple out-of-body experiences. And we were able to see beings that were not there physically, and then we each took our notes. But the interesting thing was, after having taken the notes, when we cross-checked, multiple people saw the same thing. So, for example, in one case, I saw, I think it was two people standing in a specific spot, and so did two other people, and they all pointed at the same spot, same number of people doing the same thing, standing, um, observing. And there were other interesting things that happened, like we were able to see targets at a distance that later on turned out to be correct, right? So, seeing things at a distance, that's more showing that consciousness is not necessarily confined to our brain, but that it could extend outward, right? It doesn't speak directly to the survival hypothesis, but you can see how the out of body experience could be used to see and confirm that there are people who are not physical, who survive death, and they're there. They exist. They're around. And you can observe what they do. And if you have more than one person observing the same thing, even at the same time, you have even stronger evidence that it's not just something you're imagining, because what are the odds that they're all imagining the same thing at the same time, even though it has nothing to do with something they read in a movie or that they saw in a movie or read in a book. It's just something unexpected. And the other part is, sometimes we have things that we can meet someone that we meet after death and ask them that we can confirm, right? So you saw the case with the Queen of Sweden, but more recently, I had a student in Florida when I was living in and teaching in Miami, where he was in Miami, but he was able to have an out of body experience, go to Buenos Aires, and meet his dying father-in-law, who was in a coma, but he was able to interact with him through an out of body experience. And the father-in-law told him about a bank account that no one knew about, and he asked him to tell his wife, surviving wife, about the bank account, which bank it was in, and even gave some instructions what his last wishes were regarding what to do with that money. So you can imagine that was an awkward conversation, but the point is that they did actually find that everything that he relayed was correct. Right? I think he even knew the bank account number, but not entirely sure he was able to remember that. But the fact he knew that there was an account, which bank, approximately, how much, that it was enough to buy certain things. That was pretty impressive. Now, moving away from these anecdotal type of evidence, which again, that's probably all you need as a person to get a stronger evidence that there is life after death. What are sort of things that might actually help us scientifically? Well, we would have to do similar experiments, but just have more controls, have more replicability, and there have been some studies along those lines with mediums, for example. So Dr. Schwartz from the University of Arizona conducted some experiments using different mediums to study the same case and see if they actually gave similar answers, right? Because they've done studies like that with astrology, where they couldn't read even each other's charts and they couldn't match each other's charts. So in the case of mediumship, they have been able to do studies where there was some consistency, so much so that it was statistically significant. So mediumship definitely is one area where, if you just rely on one person telling you what they see, well, that could be anything. But if you have 3, 4, 5, 6 mediums telling you the same thing about the same case, and there's no way they can be coordinating, then that's more interesting, right? Definitely. So that's one place where we can look for evidence, right? Another interesting area is just when people use not so much channeling type mediumship, but just clairvoyance. So if you have multiple people who are able to see something that is not there physically through clairvoyance, and that they can cross-reference their findings and they're consistent, that also would be suggestive, would be interesting, especially if they're able to capture some sort of information to bring back, right? To cross-check. And another type of evidence that we've seen is people's. It's almost like a variety of the out-of-body experience, but the near-death experience, right? So what's interesting about the near-death experience is that you have someone who becomes medically dead, right? So they, of course, death is a process. So what it means is that they probably flatlined, right? Their heart rate, their heart stopped. They're slowly going into brain death, and they are able to be revived, and they obviously were not completely dead, right? So they were on their way to the irreversible death. But for some moments, their body was as good as dead, and they experienced an out of body experience during the NDE, and they are able to see things sometimes at a distance, and they're able to report their findings, and it and in many cases they meet people that have already passed away, and they bring back information from them as well. So again, the NDE, because it's near death, you could be very strict and say that it only indicates that the consciousness might be able to exist beyond the body. It might extend itself, but it is fairly suggestive that it didn't need to rely on the body to exist, right? Basically, if our emotions really only came from the body, and the body is in a basically vegetative state, that there's not a whole lot of brainwave activity or heart function or anything like that, but we're still able to exist and fully function, sometimes even function at a more expanded state, then it doesn't seem to be coming from the body. Rather, it seems like the other way around, that we as a consciousness are animating the body as long as we can, right? So looking at the evidence of near-death experiences is interesting, especially the ones where they're prospective, meaning that people figure that, okay, a certain number of people that come in with heart failure or something like that are going to experience a near-death experience, maybe 8, 11%, something like that. And so we might as well set up some experiments where, while they're having an out-of-body experience, an NDE, they might be able to see some numbers at some object at the that we put close to the ceiling, something they can't see from where they're lying down, and that might help us validate the fact that they really are existing beyond the body, right? So there have been some studies done along those lines as well, that you can look up, studies on near-death experience, prospective studies on the near-death experience. And then, of course, there are other kind of interesting approaches that have been done where you use electronic devices, phenomena, to try and capture some sort of contact with the afterlife. That's a little difficult, but there are people doing these electronic voice phenomena type studies, instrumental transcommunication, ITC. So that's another area of investigation. You can look into as well. And of course, there are some rare phenomena like poltergeist, where it appears that non-physical beings are creating all sorts of crazy phenomena that are physical. Now, there have been parapsychologists that have studied this closely. Like I had the pleasure to meet Bill Roll when he was still with us, and he he actually observed these phenomena very closely. And what he noticed is that they were always tied to a physical person. In sometimes like prepubescent boys, girls, but many times, um, or at least in some cases, it was young girls. And wherever she would go, so would the phenomenon, or the phenomenon will only happen in a space whenever she was around. So he posited that it was actually caused by the human person, right? Which is a very reasonable hypothesis. He called it super psi theory. Um, However, for people who have had out of body experiences often and have been able to observe that there are non physical beings or beings that have survived physical death or in between lives, then they would probably now go along with the super psi theory. But if you're only observing things from the physical perspective, then it is the simplest explanation for a lot of these phenomena. But you can see how poltergeist might show you that the human consciousness can do amazing things. It doesn't necessarily prove that there's life after death. So there's a lot of evidence about psychic phenomena, psi phenomena, the paranormal, whatever you want to call it, and there's actually quite a lot of evidence about telepathy and about remote viewing and about even uh, the ability to affect physical phenomena, physical devices. But none of that necessarily proves that there's an afterlife, right? So it seems like if you really want to know, the proof is in the pudding, and by which I don't mean to experience death, right? We will all experience death sooner or later, but that can wait. So short of that, how else can we find out in a way where we can continue to enjoy this physical life? Well, the out of body experience, you can think of it as a sort of rehearsal of death, because your body goes to sleep, not forever, but temporarily, and you are able to project, preview death in a sense, overcome the fear of death, which is huge, and see what's beyond. But you get to come back, and you get to do that multiple times. So that's definitely very appealing and interesting. And if you do it enough times, you'll be able to collect enough evidence to your satisfaction that it's not just a dream and that there is more than that. Another line of inquiry that is worth looking into, but again, one that's difficult to do for yourself, but not impossible, is to look at the fact that if there is survival death, there might also be reincarnation, right? So that's even harder to prove. But the point is this: that if you survive death, there's a chance that you also will return. Or put a different way, there's a chance that we have been returning multiple times. So it would be interesting to see if there are some cases where there might be evidence of that going on. So if there's evidence of reincarnation, then that encompasses also evidence of uh, life after death, right? And more. So the work of Ian Stevenson, Jim Tucker, and others, coming out of University of Virginia and other places around the world, that is very interesting because it shows children that were interviewed who were able to give details of the previous personality's life, the people they knew, even nicknames, things, major events in their life, how they died, and their likes and dislikes, and the odds of that matching are astronomical. And the other thing is that sometimes they had physical, biological evidence suggestive that they are that person. How? Um, the manner of death of the previous personality could, in some cases, left a wound in the body that translated into a sort of birthmark, a very unusual birthmark that matched the wound, like entry and exit bullet wounds from the previous personality now are in the same spots as birthmarks. So they collected several of these cases, a couple hundred of them, and there were 20, I think. There were very, very strong cases, and they were even published in a major journal of psychiatry in Europe. So that is another place that I would recommend you looking into it. I had the opportunity to interview Jim Tucker in the past, as well as a attorney who would present cases to the Supreme Court in Australia. So this barrister collected various types of evidence of the afterlife and presented it in the fashion of a court case, right? So in a court, you don't have to prove things are absolutely true, only because that's not reasonable, right? Only beyond reasonable doubt. So he made a case about the afterlife, beyond reasonable doubt, at least in his opinion, right? And it's a really great book, and I've posted here in the links, in the comments, a link to a talk that we did some years ago that you might find that interesting. And I would invite you to take the Consciousness Development Program. It's a wonderful course that I think you can still take the first couple of parts of it for free, because we're still experiencing COVID-19 around the world, and that's one of the ways IAC would like to support you. And you will learn not just theory about these things, but techniques on how you can actually experience some of these phenomena for yourself, collect the evidence for yourself, and highly encourage you to do so. And if you have any other questions, please feel free, enter them into the comments, talk to us, let us know, and we'll be glad to get in touch with you and help you in your explorations. Until then, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this brief chat, and don't be a stranger. Find us at iacworld.org or right here on social media. Thank you.